Welcome back to U.S. History. I hope your first online test went well, better than you expected. I'm going to try to get those graded as fast as I can, and I have with me my lovely assistant. Can you look at the camera and say hi? Say hi, yeah. And so we'd like to introduce this chapter, chapter 21, the 1920s, a decade of change. And speaking of change, which you've got ink all over your fingers. Speaking of change, hey, do you want to tell them how much you've grown? You had your 15-month appointment today, yet you grew 2 inches in 2 months, and you've only gained 1 pound though. But that's fine. He said you're perfectly healthy. All right, you're distracted with ink. I'll let you go while I teach the lesson. Can you blow him a kiss? Oh, thank you. That's sweet. Can you give me a kiss? Can you give me a kiss? That's a no. Denied by my own child. Bye, Sam. All right. Sticker. Okay. Moving on with chapter 21, a decade of change. We are now moving from the Treaty of Versailles, World War I, into the post-war world. And so that brings us to Roman numeral I, the post-war environment. And the post-war environment was kind of a rocky one. President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, ended up suffering a stroke. He never regained full health, and it says in your textbook on page 413 that his wife and one of his top aides, Colonel House, basically ran the White House while Wilson, after Wilson had suffered his stroke, until the next election, which was won by Warren G. Harding, a Republican. Now, many Americans were glad that the United States did not join the League of Nations. They said, we don't want to join this global society. We kind of just want to revert back to isolationism. Look what European affairs got us into. They got us into World War I. We're done with all of that. We want to stay on our own and focus on ourselves. And so Warren Harding ran on a campaign slogan that was called a return to normalcy. He was promising Americans, I'm going to get you back to how life used to be. Kind of like what President Trump is doing now to try to give Americans hope during this whole quarantine period. Basically telling people, I'm going to try to fill the churches by Easter. He said, I'm going to try to have businesses open and we'll have a return to normalcy. And so throughout the 1920s, starting with Harding's presidency, we see that the United States practiced isolationism, where they focused on themselves and not on foreign affairs. We also see the introduction to communism in the United States. The rise and spread of communism began to worry many Americans. In fact, in the 1920s, we see the creation of 2 communist political parties in the United States. And these 2 communist parties, what they wanted to do was to create friction. This was their game plan. Create friction between the working class people and property-owning capitalists. Now, we've seen this in today's society with one of our presidential candidates that I think he's about to drop out if he hasn't already, Bernie Sanders, always talking about the friction between the 1% and the working class Americans. That's why he's always saying, McDonald's needs to pay a living wage. Okay, with his eyes bugging, that's Bernie Sanders creating friction between the working class Americans and the property owning capitalists. And so Americans, though, they began to think that anytime that there was a strike by workers or by unions, they believed that the communists were behind this, because they said, who else wants to revolt against the property-owning capitalists? It's the workers. It's the labor unions. So a lot of people began to distrust the labor unions, believing that the Communist Party was behind those strikes. And there happened to be a series of anarchist bombings. And an anarchist is someone who doesn't want any form of government, just basically free reign. You're able to do whatever you want. And so, because of these bombings, the United States government began to question whether it was the actions of the communist parties. And so, after these bombings, the government began arresting members of radical organizations, whether it be anarchist organizations or even communist organizations. And so, this puts the United States into this state of heightened, worried awareness about what was going on around them politically. And so there was a lot of unrest. And not only was there political unrest, but there was economic unrest. Farmers began having a hard time selling off their products. The government tried to give them a buyout, basically give them money to keep them afloat. We're seeing that right now, where the president is signing a stimulus package that's going to basically help out a lot of the companies in the United States. Also, soldiers, once they came back from the war, many of them weren't able to find jobs. And so we see that the United States is in political, moral, and financial disarray. And that's going to set us up for the Roaring 20s in our next lecture. All right, so that concludes our lecture for today. Trying to think if there's anything that I want to go over. You are going to have a reading assignment after you watch this lecture. So after you finished watching this lecture, you need to read pages 416 to 420, and there will be a reading assessment on Google Classroom. So if you go to your classwork page, there will be reading assessment number 2. Go ahead and complete that. That will be a completion grade. All right, so that'll be a completion grade. I'll try to have those graded as soon as possible as well. So that's the reading assessment number 2. That'll be due on March 27th, okay, at the end of the day, March 27th. This lecture, of course, is to be watched on March 26th. And so that's all the information I have. So I hope that you have a great rest of the day. If you're going stir crazy in quarantine, come up with some exercises to do. Maybe do planks, jumping jacks, any type of physical activity you can do to keep yourself busy. Excuse me. And I will catch you next time. Take care.